Now, tonight, we have Hugh King and Ken Cullum, who always bring us an interesting program, so I know there are going to be some laughs tonight. And I think it's going to be a really interesting topic about the Iron Horse coming to East Hampton. It must have been a huge change in East Hampton at the time. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again next year.
Thank you all for coming. We'd like to thank the East Hampton Historical Society for sponsoring these talks. I'd like to thank Mike from LTV. They're always here. And you can purchase your DVD for $9.95. No, all right. Also, I'd like to thank Robert Cody and Peggy DeSuno, who did much research about the DeSuno family. And then I'd like to thank Mary Delapola Curls, who's here tonight, and Lucy Natal Bennett, who's also here tonight, and Lucy Napolillo Cuomo for doing further research and helping me find the stories of some of the people we're going to talk about tonight. I would also like to thank Jim Devine, who is part of our story tonight, and I don't want to give too much away, but he was very, very helpful. And of course, as usual, Richard Barons, who gave us lots of background material on the railroad. Just remember that, okay? All right. Before we begin, though, Ken has some breaking news about a great train robbery that has taken place.
If Richard could hit the next slide for us. We're looking for this despicable character who has been possibly stealing clams off the Nappig station. If you've seen this gentleman in the audience, please report him to the local police department. Unfortunately, I don't believe he is here this evening, but the photograph is unbelievable. So if you see that gentleman, please report him to your local police station for stealing clams off of the Cannonball at the Nappig station. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Okay. All right, now this is what's going to happen. Every time we get to a new topic, I'm going to go, and you're all going to yell, all aboard? All right, you ready? So, okay, thank you. The first thing I want to read is something that the East Hampton Town historian, Stuart Vorpool, told me to find in the East Hampton Town trustee records. Remember, tonight, it's the Iron Horse, how it's changed East Hampton. Members of the various boards of trustees who sold adjoining owners of upland the undivided beachlands and dunes to the grass line or highway line asserted that their decision to sell worked wonders for East Hampton, Amagansett, Georgia, and Wainscott, that it enabled descendants and heirs of original proprietors to sell oceanfront and beach bank sites to city sojourners. These annual visitors to East Hampton, attracted by the many fine features of the locality, its beauty, its quaint colonial settings, and its quiet charms, were enabled to buy and occupy lands and establish a summer colony along the ocean front. This, so say members of the old trustee boards who are still living, contributed more than any other thing toward the progress and prosperity of the community and far exceeded the benefits derived from the arrival of the railroad in 1895. So tonight's talk is immaterial. Okay, you have an image here of Clinton Academy. They called it Clinton Hall at the time, but it really didn't become Clinton Hall until 1886. Okay. At a special town meeting held in the Academy on March 12, 1868. By a large negative majority, people in the town of East Hampton refused to authorize bonds of $28,000 for the construction of a railroad from the bounds of Southampton to the village of Sag Harbor. Another vote to authorize bonds of $40,000 to aid in the construction of a railroad that may be constructed to East Hampton in connection with the South Side Railroad or with the Long Island Railroad at Riverhead, voted negative by a small majority. Now we have March 26, 1868, at the Academy Hall. There was a proposition to donate $40,000 to aid in the construction of a railroad to connect with the South Side Railroad and to terminate in East Hampton below the Hook. The vote was negative by a small majority. And then it was resolved at this meeting that we are opposed to calling any more meetings to test the railroad question, as we are desirous of attending to our own business and allowing other people to attend to theirs. On a motion, it was voted to lay this resolution on the table. Annual town meeting, 1868. We're still in the academy. A resolution was passed to aid in the extension of the South Side Railroad to the village of Sag Harbor within the bounds of the towns of East Hampton in the amount of $25,000. All right, right? Yeah, April 30th, 1868. Resolved that the resolution passed at the annual town meeting be rescinded. And the supervisor be hereby instructed not to issue any more bonds on the credit of the town for such a purpose. All right, now we could have the next slide. Okay, now, of course, that's the 1717 church. And at a special town meeting on May 10th, 1870 at the old church, so the church was still standing in 1870, there was a proposal to appoint a committee of 5 persons to meet with M.O. Charlick, president of the LIRR, in relation to extending the branch road through the village. The vote was decided in the negative. All right. Well, I could find no more discussions of the railroad at town meetings. So where do we wind up? Newspaper articles report that in 1893, at a meeting of citizens, real estate people, and property owners, there was a favorable view of the extension of the railroad. In May of 1893, the Committee of East Hampton Citizens for the Railroad guaranteed Austin Corbin, president of the LIRR, all that he wanted, including condemnation of lands. 3/4 of the property owners involved sold their land at reasonable prices. So the Iron Horse did eventually come to East Hampton. Yeah, take that down. But Mariella, thank you. Mariella Moeller donated tonight's talk. And then that's it, Mariella. We're not going to see you. Sorry.
Okay, can we have the next slide? So, this is the cannonball, the famous cannonball that ran to East Hampton. Now, has anybody been following the news today? What's coming back? The cannonball is coming back, an hour and a half to West Hampton nonstop. So that means a lot more folks will be visiting us this summer. So that could be good, that could be bad. Less cars, I figure. Okay, can we have the next slide? Now, there's the famous cannonball. It's Friday afternoon in May at Hunts Point Avenue, and you're riding in the first cannonball of the summer. The season in East Hampton. Imagine yourself sitting in one of the Yale deck chairs on the rear of this train. The attendant has opened the door to serve you a cool adult beverage. Not bad. You're back in a different era when folks of means had not yet developed the vocabulary to discuss what type of rock they filtered their bottled water. Gin and tonic with extra lime, you tell the attendant, no need to specify a brand. Mr. Mack only serves the very best. And if you've ridden before with Gus Golden, your amiable parlor attendant, he has already got your Gordon's and White Rock tonic ready to go. And there's a different time in the Long Island Railroad when people like Mr. Mack and the LIRR president Tom Goodfellow knew that passenger was spelled with capital letters. Next slide, please. This is the cannonball pulled into Montauk. There's the manor behind it. Now, if you came out on a Friday evening on the cannonball, what would you go back on Sunday night? Next slide. The Sundowner. They would change the rear plate of that, and it would go back as the Sundowner on Sunday evening. Okay, next slide. Who pulled the cannonball? Camelback. Okay, who's the engineer? James C. Eichhorn. Now, I have my lovely mother-in-law and lovely wife in the front row. That is my mother-in-law's great-grandfather and my wife's great-great-grandfather. So let's have next slide. Okay, that's James C. Eichhorn and what he called his office. He retired in the 50s, and at the dinner, the poster read, "We've all ridden behind old Jim, now let's come out and dine with him." And next slide, please. Okay, Iron Horse has come to East Hampton. This is East Hampton Station, and they are getting off the train. Railroad reaches East Hampton, providing easy access for visitors. The residents begin to think seriously about the appearance of our village as an asset to encourage visitors. So remember, this started a long time ago. The new editor of the East Hampton Star, Edward S. Boughton, publishes a notice calling for the formation of an improvement society. Notice to all ladies who are interested in the Village Improvement Society are requested to meet at the annex of the hall. What hall? Clinton Hall. Next slide, please. That's a picture of Clinton with the hall attached to it. Meeting at evening at 7 p.m. He adds a donation to get things started. 22 women attend the meeting at Clinton Hall. 21 sign the rolls and became members. Officers are elected. A constitution and bylaws are approved. Next slide, please. And the LVIS is formed. A field of labor the society has prescribed by the Constitution includes highways, sidewalks, cemeteries, and other work for the general interest and welfare of the village. The society is well organized, starts off with a promising outlook. The first meeting is conducted by the ladies' most credible fare, the business being carried out expeditiously and in good parliamentary order. Next slide. This is a picture of one of their fairs, fundraising back in the early 1900s. And the next slide. There's a picture of Main Street. In the early years, the group erects flagpoles, raises flags each day, and displays flags up and down Main Street on holidays. Over 100 honeysuckles are planted around the two cemeteries, north and south. Grass is planted on the new railroad banks, and Virginia creeper is planted at the station. Next slide. They began raising funds to water down Main Street, sweep the crosswalks, clean up the station, and install oil lamps on Main Street, and hire a lamplighter. Now this over here is one of the wagons that they would have used to water Main Street to keep the dust down. We have the next slide. This is the railroad station a little west of, which would be the baggage terminal. You can see how bare it looks. And the next slide. Here's a picture of the station. And the next slide will show what the ladies have done. And another slide, please. Okay, here's the taxi cabs of the day. You notice all the buggies are backed into the station. There's one of those dusty roads that they would be watering down. There's a story that goes that Mr. Osborne, who had the Osborne Inn, which is the old Maidstone Arms, or I think it's care of Maidstone now, he had a buggy that would go and pick you up at the station and bring you up to his inn. And next slide. And that's a color postcard of what it would have looked like while the ladies were attending to that station when our visitors were coming in. All right, Mr. King, it's your... Oh, here we go. Everybody ready?
Good man, Kenny.
All right.
Okay. The second story that we're going to be telling is entitled, Little Italy Comes to the Hamptons. Late in the 19th century and early 20th century, Italy was beset by poverty, overpopulation, and natural disasters. The government was dominated by northerners. Southern Italy was hurt by high taxes, and there was a scarcity of land to cultivate. These conditions led to a large influx of Italians emigrating to America, including my grandfather, Frank Pepe. Many immigrants did not plan to stay, so they did not want to farm. They headed for the cities and were likely to take heavy construction jobs. About half of 19th century Italian immigrants were manual laborers, digging tunnels, laying railroad track, and constructing bridges and tunnels. As you know, Italian laborers laid much of the track between Bridgehampton and Montauk. Can we have the next slide, please? This is an area, if you want to find Nuska on this map, and where is it?
B.
B, right there, okay. Most, the people who I'm going to be talking about now came from this one area in Nuska and knew each other before they came to America. Okay, now I guess we could do the next slide. There he is. That is Joseph Della Pola. The first Italian family to arrive in Amagansett was the Della Pola family, when Joseph Della Pola arrived from Nuska with his wife Filomena DeSuno, a sister to Carmine DeSuno, who would arrive next. There's not much we could find out about Joseph Della Pola, but we're assuming, we're pretty sure he did work on the railroad, okay? And then we had the Nuska, so let's go to the next image. That's little Mike, or Amato Della Pola, okay? Joseph's brother Amato arrived alone in 1903 with $20 in his pocket. He was told money grew on trees in America. He brought a twig from his grape arbor in Italy that is still growing today. In 1908, he bought a house and property next door to his brother Joseph. Amato worked for the Long Island Railroad at Montauk, shoveling coal for 18 years. After leaving the railroad, he worked as a caretaker and gardener for more than 18 years. The second family to arrive in Amagansett was the DeSuno family. Carmine DeSuno arrived from Nuska in 1906, but he received permission from the railroad to go home to marry. He was drafted into the service and fought in the Italian-Turkish War in 1911-1912. He then leaves his wife and 2 children to come to America to earn money. He intended to live in Long Island City, where he had relatives, but he saw people that he thought were mafia types, so he decided to settle in Amagansett, where his sister Filomena Della Pola already lived. By 1914, his family, his wife and 2 daughters, Mary and Ann, were here. He eventually buys property from Bunker Hill Road to Cranberry Hill Road. He then sells parcels to Mike Natal and Stephen Napolillo. In 1923, he built DeSuno Motors, which was, and also a small store next to it that Mr. DeSuno had built for his daughter Mary. Can we have that image? There it is. There's Mr. DeSuno. There is the store. No, there's the store, and there's the garage. And you know who Mary DeSuno turned out to be? Mary Cantwell, the mother of the village administrator. She was the oldest one to come here. All right, that's Mr. DeSuno. Now, Carmine DeSuno worked as a hostler for the railroad. It was his job to prepare the engine for the next day's run. I think we have another image now. That's the Y that was behind Mr. DeSuno's house, because the railroad ended there at one time. All right, so all he had to do was go out his back door and he was at work. All right. I think we have an image of the engine he worked on too, don't we, Ken?
Next slide.
Yeah, there it is. That's the engine that Mr. DeSuno worked on that was back behind his house. Okay, now I think we have another image. No, that's the railroad station, right? In Amagansett? Yes, sir. All right, keep going.
Next one's Promised Land.
Promised Land, right. There was a train station down at Promised Land, a train stop down at Promised Land, because of the fish factory down there, okay? The third family to arrive was the Napolillo family. By the way, I have to tell you something about Mr. DeSuno. Many of the people all over, not just down in that area. You know where we're talking about? Okay? You go past the IGA, right? You keep going. There's Billy Vorpal's garage is in the building now. I think Harvey Bennett's in that building. That's where we're talking about, in that whole area. But when you went away and you lived in that area, and nobody put their money in the bank, all right? They all kept it in the house. Well, when you went away from the area for a while, you gave your money to Mr. DeSuno. And when you came back, you didn't have to count it. And that was a story told to me by Larry Cantwell, and that story was told to him by Carlton Kelsey. All right. So if it's not wrong, if it's wrong, I'm really covered. Okay. All right. The third family to come was the Napolillo family in the presence of John and Stephen Napolillo. John owned a cement block on his property. So this is Stephen Napalillo on the right. Came to America first in 1903 at the age of 14, and then worked in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. He returned back to Italy 3 times, served 7 years in the Italian army, and arrives in Amagansett in 1918. Stephen worked at nights at the railroad turnstile behind Mr. DeSuno's house. He eventually quit the railroad and worked as a caretaker for several estates. Okay, our next slide. The last family to settle in Amagansett was headed by Mike Natal, and that's Mike Natal. He fought for Italy in World War I and was taken prisoner by the Germans. The Natals were close friends with the DeSunos and knew, so Mike and his family joined Carmine DeSuno in Amagansett, where he found employment with the railroad and stayed with the railroad until he retired in 1952. His job was to keep the engine running at night. Now, do we have one of all that land there? There we go. You see? There's Montauk Highway. There's the Delapolas. There is Napalillo. And there's Natal. And this is Bunker Hill Road. And for many years, you know, the road was filled with DeSunos. And a lot of all this land eventually came from Mr. Carmine DeSuno all the way in here. Now, my grandfather, who was Italian, used to go down to Mr. DeSuno's every Sunday in the 1927 Dodge to check on Mr. DeSuno's garden. See? Then he'd go over and check on the Iorio's garden. And then he'd go check, so they would compare notes. And I'm really connected to the railroad because my mother had a friend in the city whose aunt was Mrs. Black. Mrs. Black had a variety store in Amagansett. You know where it was? Right across from where Vinnie's Barbershop, there are 2 stores, that famous historic landmark Pink Chicken, right? And then there's a tack store there, but that was one store. It was Mrs. Black's variety store. So my mother comes with this woman out to Amagansett to see Mrs. Black. But they got on the Cannonball, and they wound up in Montauk before cell phones. So eventually they come back, and because my grandfather knew the DeSunos, Gladys DeSuno introduced my mother to my father. And then, because my father worked on the railroad as a fireman, he kept getting furloughed. So what did he do? He quit and started the plumbing business in Amagansett. Okay, there we go. Let me get this out of your way, buddy boy.
All right. Can we get the next slide, please? All right, we're going out to Camp Wyckoff. Now, everybody knew where Camp Wyckoff was, right? Where? Third house, right? We're all told third house. Okay, next slide. Well, Camp Wyckoff was all over Montauk. It went all the way up by the water tower, all the way out to the lake. Sure, yeah, look at this, fancy pointer. The Montauk Association over there is General Wheeler's headquarters. He was over in the Montauk Association because he wanted to be somewhere that was nice. But you notice they go all the way from Fort Pond, what now is Lake Montauk. So it wasn't just, I think the rough third house is off the side there. So it completely covered most of Montauk, which I found interesting when we found this. I said to Hugh, I said, where's, you know, he says, oh, third house. I showed him this. He goes, wow. So we've got some images that are pretty interesting of this. So let's go to the next slide. There he is. That's who was in charge, everybody thought, but actually it was General Wheeler. And we have another slide that's kind of interesting. Now, can anybody look at this slide? I never thought about it until Hugh, but what looks wrong about this slide? He's writing a letter. He's obviously in his tent, but what is peculiar about him? He's got his gloves on. Anybody write letters with gloves on? You suppose that was staged? I think that was staged. All right. So, let's go to the next slide. All right, here we go. During the summer of 1898, the Long Island Railroad ran 1,207 regular daily trains and an average of 139 extra trains. The facilities at Montauk were small and limited to a station, one side track holding 10 cars and a Y. The establishment of Camp Wyckoff And the extra traffic involved in serving this camp resulted in leasing of the Long Island Railroad leasing 10 Central Railroad of New Jersey locomotives and their crews. So they leased 10 of these locomotives from the Central Jersey Railroad. 4.5 miles of new track were laid at Montauk and 28 switches were installed. 5,200 cubic yards of fill were required. And next slide. So this is what happened to Montauk. Work on the yard began on Thursday, August 4th, with 162 men. The yard was ready for use on Sunday, get this, the 7th, 4 days later. The men were fed sandwiches and coffee 3 times a day. Have the next slide. You can imagine this is all down where Rough Riders is, the old Ocean Science Lab. The steamboat you can see out on the edge of the pier there. The rail actually extended out there. The steamboat actually brought troops up from Cuba. And the next slide, they had a nice officers club, I guess, here for the entertainment. Water tower here. In 7 days' time, now we've 4 days, we've got all this. In 7 days, 105 men built a coal tower, 2 platforms for unloading animals and wagons, a dormitory, 30 tents, a cookhouse, an eating room for the general public, waiting rooms, 2 large buildings for the express company, a freight house, and a 20,000-gallon water tank. And a pipe was laid from high ground 1,300 feet away, and a pump and a boiler were set up to bring water down to this camp. So what do you suppose they didn't have? They didn't have cell phones to interrupt them all day long. They actually got work done. Next slide, please. These are some slides showing the extent of what was going on down there. We have the next slide. This is looking down from on top of the hill. I think they called it Observatory Hill, down across Fort Pond, out towards Eddie Eckers Park. Just amazing what was going on. Have the next slide. That is President McKinley and General Wheeler down in Montauk. For the government, 2 large storehouses, a hospital, a detention camp were built, and at this time there were 2 lines entering Eastport, but from there to Montauk lay 45 miles of a single track. During August and September, an average of 46 trains ran daily. The maximum number of trains in a 24-hour period was 50. So you can imagine the train traffic. The next slide, please. These are some of the provisions being offloaded. The railroad hired an extra 218 men. They strung 7 additional telegraph wires, installed telephone lines, and at this time there was no block signaling system in effect, except on the west end of the railroad. Trains ran by timetable and train orders only. So can you imagine trying to be in charge of running that many trains in a 24-hour period strictly by a clock and train orders? Next slide, please. These are some of the men coming off of the ships. Total carried to Montauk 3,350 officers and men in 310 coaches. From Montauk, when they broke the camp down, 13,031 officers and men in 731 coaches. Many had arrived from Cuba by ship. Approximately 13,000 officers and men were carried on regular trains requiring 341 coaches. 4,018 cars carried baggage freight, including 7,750 horses and about 1,000 mules. The largest amount of troop trains in one day was 18. Regular trains were kept on time. So I've got a few more photographs which we'll flip through here, which are kind of interesting of the area. There's the great grazing plains of Montauk. There's no houses, there's no trees. It's where they used to drive the cattle and the sheep out to graze. The next slide. They're watering the horses in Lake Montauk. It was not open to the ocean, or the bay rather, at that time. Another picture looking out over the plains of Montauk. The next slide. There's some of the The bottom one there says it's Colonel Roosevelt and staff on their horses. Next slide. And here's some of the review. And I found one thing that was kind of interesting. We're actually going to take a step back in time and actually review the troops, so we can go to the next slide. It says 1902, but I think that's the review of the troops, and that's Fort Pond in the background. No cartoons this year, I'm sorry. I think Mr. King just went by in that picture.
Blow the whistle.
Next slide, please.
Thank you, Ken.
All right, we'll get your shit on.
Okay, our next story begins far, far away. In where? Not quite. Oh, yeah, not quite. It begins in the Seychelles Islands, okay? Now, so far, we've had the railroad bringing the formation of the LVIS, bringing a whole series of people to an area in Amagansett, certainly making it possible for all the soldiers to come back from the Spanish-American War. And now we're beginning in the Seychelles Islands. Let's have the next slide, please. That's Joseph Toussaint Laporte. Okay. They used to call him Joe 2 Cents. You know why? They couldn't pronounce Toussaint. And doesn't it mean, honey, all angels? Yes, that's what his middle name means. All right. Joseph Laporte was born in Mount Fleury on the island of Mahé, or I don't know how to pronounce it, M-A-H-E, largest of the Seychelles group of 80 small islands. His father, a chief of police in Mount Fleury, died when he was 11, leaving his mother with 10 children. His mother brought him a little sailboat, and he went offshore fishing. At 13, he took a job on a sloop, fishing along the African coast. They met an American whaling ship, the Alice Knowles, with 2 other boys. He went on board and was promised a job. 2 weeks later, the boys said goodbye to their families and were to be picked up, but the captain had changed his mind. He had to post a bond for them, and he said he didn't have the money. The second mate then stowed them below deck in the bow. They were fed on molasses, lamb juice, crackers, and corned beef. When the captain found out, he planned to drop them off at Durban, a South African port. But Joe and his companions proved their worth to the captain by hard work, and they were eventually signed up as able seamen. After several whaling voyages, Joe was ready to try something else and found himself in New Bedford with a little money in his pocket. He noticed an advertisement for men to work at a fish factory on Hicks Island in Promised Land. Joe's jobs at the fish factory were running the ferry and cooking. The year was 1910 when he came to East Hampton. During World War I, he served overseas with the 77th Infantry. After the armistice, he was with the Division of Criminal Investigation because of his knowledge of French and Portuguese. And he did guard duty with the Army of Occupation in Germany. He married Marguerite Fowler. I think we could have the next image. That's Marguerite on the left. That's Joe on the right having a sandwich. And we cannot figure out who the people are in the middle. Yet. All right, he married Marguerite Fowler, who was the daughter of 2 Montaukets. She was born and lived her entire life in Freetown. When Joe Laporte died, he was employed as a special policeman at the school crossing at Pantago and Skimhampton. I think we have an image of that too, don't we? Oh, that's Marguerite Fowler again. Okay. And the next slide. Okay, here we go. October 2nd, 1957. Mr. Joseph Laporte, East Hampton, New York. Dear Sir, on Tuesday, the town board appointed you as special patrolman at $2 per hour or $5 per day to direct the school children at the Pantago School starting immediately. Now, where was the Panago School? Remember in the, is it in the 60s? Mid-50s, yes, because when I went to East Hampton High School, we were on double session for the first 2 years. So in the mid-50s, they moved some of the lower grade children down in Skim Hampton. Yeah, but who owned the buildings? Parr. Louis Parr owned these two buildings, and they retrofitted them to put the children down there. And then Joe was hired to work as a crossing guard. And now Barbara Borsak has a little story to tell about Joe and the crossing guard down there.
Well, I was just telling Hugh that we loved to ride our bikes to school because Mr. Laporte was the crossing guard, and he would cross us. And when you left school in the afternoon and he crossed you, he gave you lollipops. They couldn't do that anymore, but everybody loved that because he got a lollipop. And the year that he died, they had, in the Memorial Day Parade, the school had a float in his honor, and all the school children walked alongside and handed out lollipops.
Joseph was given a military service at his funeral, and a flagpole was erected in front of the John Marshall School in his honor. There's also a Joseph Laporte Citizenship Award given out each year at the John Marshall School. Now, what does that have to do with the railroad? Nothing. But the next story does. Francis Laporte was also born in the Seychelles Islands. As a teenager, he ventured forth as a whaler. After being around the world, he followed his brother Joseph to East Hampton. He worked as a track repairman for the Long Island Railroad and later ran with his brother a neighborhood grocery store on Springs Fireplace Road in the Freetown area. You know where that store was? If you're going down Springs Fireplace Road, right before you get to almost across the street from the Calvary Baptist Church, there's that little store. It's just been renovated. That's where that store was. Okay? Now, he married the former Nellie Collins. All right, and there she is later in her life. That's Nellie Laporte. Okay, now, why is Francis Laporte coming to East Hampton to work on the railroad important? Between them, Francis Laporte and Nellie Laporte raised 40 foster children. Now, I'm going to read from a note that Jim Devine was one of these children. So I asked him, where did they find 40 children to adopt? And he said, no, we were not adopted. We were foster children. My mother, that's Frances, had 2 sons, John and James, by her first husband. But her work as a live-in meant that someone else had to take care of her own children. I think she missed the joys of motherhood, and when she married Francis, it was too late to do this with her own children. Somehow, and I don't know how, she took in a foster child. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, and she took care of over 40. But 8 of us stuck to her like glue and became a family. The others had family problems that were resolved and moved on. But in the cases of the 8, even when our natural parents' problems seemed to be resolved, the county advised us against moving because we had bonded as a family. It's like we chose them to be our parent. And those children, I've only found 7 of them. Billy Harris, Doug Tilton, Marvin Collins, John Hayes, Mary McHugh, Jim Devine, and Curtis Mayberry all stayed here and were raised in East Hampton because of the Laportes and because of the railroad. That's great. You got your pointer? I got the pointer. There you go. Thank you. Sorry. All right. Can we have the next slide, please? There it is. Anybody know what it is? Yep. Fishing Village in Montauk, Fish Shangri-La. The railroad brought out plenty of fishermen to the Montauk fishing docks. The next slide. There they are, coming off the railroad, getting ready to run down to the boats and get on to go fishing. And we're going to go through a few slides. Next slide, please. There's a brochure that was put out. It was at the time when they first started, it was $1.50 round trip.
Next slide. There's, you can see them, they're running to the boats. And we have the next slide. There they come. Now the reason why they're running to the boats is because they would secure their fishing spot by putting their rod on the rail and tying it off, and that's how they would secure their spot so that they could fish. That's why, you know, it was kind of like reserving your seat at a restaurant or tipping up the chair or putting your napkin on the chair. The next slide. There they are loading on the dock. I don't know how the dock stood up, but there they go. The next slide. The railroad also provided refrigerated cars for the trip backs to keep their fish fresh. So you would put your fish in the refrigerated car, put it on ice, and you'd go back home with your catch as fresh as when you pulled it from the water. The next slide. Now there is the coveted Fisherman's Express Fishing Award. And I found that they would run an annual, and I don't know whether it was on the amount of fish or the largest type of species of fish, but you would get a conductor-like style hat pin if you won first place. It said the Fish Shangri-La dock in Montauk was very popular with fishermen as they came out from New York City on the weekends. Now we're going to go to the next slide. And this is one of the saddest stories to come out of that Fish Shangri-La. This is the Pelican disaster. And as you can see, they've got their rods tied to the railing. And the arrow right here is Captain Eddie Carroll on the Pelican. And you can see that boat is really loaded up. I'll just go into a little background on the vessel itself. Pelican was originally constructed as a passenger fishing vessel in 1940 in Brooklyn. It was known as the Bellboy II. At 14 gross tons, it was not subject to Coast Guard regulations or inspections. Only vessels over 15 gross tons were. It was equipped with a pair of Chrysler 100 horsepower motors, and at the time of the accident, the Pelican was owned by Captain Eddie Carroll, who held the Coast Guard's license, and he operated the party boat off of Fish Shangri-La dock in Montauk. On the day around the waters of Montauk, Fish Shangri-La dock was within walking distance of the Montauk Railroad Station, and on the weekends they would run the Fisherman's Special from New York to Montauk. Passengers would exit the train and climb aboard one of the waiting boats, pay their fare for a day of fishing. Okay, next slide. Okay. On September 1st, 1951, the Fisherman's Special emptied its passengers. 62 fares climbed aboard the Pelican, plus its captain and its mate. The 42-foot Pelican left Fish Shangri-La at 7:30 a.m. carrying 64 passengers and crew, which was grossly in excess of its carrying capacity. Weather forecast for the Fish Shangri-La called for a line of approaching storms and changing winds. After rounding Montauk Point, fishing on the south side of Montauk in the Atlantic Ocean for several hours, the Pelican returned to Fish Shangri-La due to rough seas around 11:30 a.m. Encountering engine trouble on the way, which lengthened the trip, the Pelican had difficulty in making time against the conditions with only one engine working. The weather changed suddenly as squall line approached, with the strongest northwest wind developing against the outgoing tide. The wind had been estimated 25 to 35 miles an hour, and waves as high as 15 feet in the rip near the point. While rounding the point, approximately 2 p.m., the Pelican was hit by two successful waves on the starboard quarter and capsized the boat, spilling most of its passengers into the water while trapping others inside the cabin. Next slide. And this is you can see this is where the boat capsized, and this is where it drifted to. The vessel then floundered. The accident occurred within sight of the Montauk Lighthouse, approximately 1 mile north of the point in an area known as Endeavor Shoals. Two private fishing boats, the Betty Ann and the Bingo II, were first to respond, rescuing passengers. The Coast Guard picket boat that responded approximately 1 hour later was only able to save one survivor who was clinging to the hull. In all, 45 passengers and crew, including the captain, Eddie Carroll, were killed. Next picture. These are some of the grieving relatives that had come out after the accident to identify their relatives. The hull was found beneath the waves and was first secured near Montauk Point by the legendary Montauk fisherman Captain Frank Mundus on his vessel, the Cricket II. Carl Forsberg, the founder of the Viking fleet, the largest fleet in Montauk, on his Viking V, and later transferred the boat to the Coast Guard picket boat, which towed the boat back into Lake Montauk, and as a result, additional bodies were recovered, which otherwise might have been lost at sea if the hull was allowed to sink. Next slide. And this is a slide of the temporary morgue that was set up down on the docks. Following the disaster, the Coast Guard investigation was conducted. The investigation board estimated the Pelican could not have safely carried more than 30 passengers, so he had 32 or more than he should have. The conditions of the overloaded boat contributed to the capsizing and the loss of life, causing the vessel to ride low in the water and exaggerating the rolling motion caused by the waves. The failure of Captain Carroll to keep himself aware of the weather conditions and properly distribute his passengers on the vessel were also cited as. The investigation also said that more stringent requirements were needed to make sure that these boats were safe. This was the formation of the T-boat regulations, 46 CFR, the Chapter T, which includes routine inspections of all vessels carrying more than 7 passengers, went into effect in 1957. All right, where's your whistle there, buddy? All right, here we go. All right, okay. Pointer,
Pointer,
stick,
stick,
go.
go. Okay. Well, that was bad news, right? Yeah, well, guess what? We got more bad news. Okay, the railroad, of course, did many wonderful things, but it also contributed to a very, very sad part of our history that we're going to end on. Isn't that great? Okay, up until 1898, the Montauquets, or the Montauks, were considered a tribe by the courts. Next slide, please. Okay, Arthur Benson. Arthur Benson made his fortune in the shipping business and was able to retire at the age of 37 in 1849. Arthur Benson purchased his 10,000 acres of Montauk at auction in 1879 for $151,000. However, there were 4 encumbrances on the purchases, one of them being the rights and privileges of the Montauquets as established by the 1703 leases. Benson's plan was to build a series of association houses to develop resort facilities at Montauk. He hired Stanford White to design the houses and Frederick Law Olmsted to landscape. Among his friends that came to Montauk were Austin Corbin Jr., president of the Long Island Railroad, and Charles Pratt, Standard Oil executive. And I think we have an image of one of the houses. Yes, that's Tick Hall, which is owned by Dick Cavett. What happened to it? What did he do? He rebuilt it exactly the way it was, right. That was one of the 8 houses. I think Roberta Gosman Donovan also lives in one of the association houses. Okay, Benson in 1880 then begins a campaign to void the encumbrances protecting the Montauk's lands and to remove the remaining Montauquets. There were approximately between 13 and 30 Montauquets living in Montauk at the time, mostly in Indian Field. Benson, how about this one? Benson convinces the East Hampton Town trustees to turn over the original documents related to the relations between the Montauks and the town. It would be kept in a safe by him. They were never returned. Some are in the Long Island Historical Society in Brooklyn. Benson then hires Nathaniel Dominey VII, who was trusted by the Montauks to negotiate with individual members of the tribe for the purchase of their land. He was not supposed to do this. He was supposed to negotiate with the tribe as a whole. Dominey purchased a parcel of land at Freetown for $150 and begins negotiating with the individual members of the Montauk. You know where Freetown is supposed to be, right? Go down Springs Fireplace Road, you get to where that little LaPorte store was, and then you go across over to 3 Mile Harbor Road. That area right in there was considered to be Freetown. So So now he begins negotiating with individual members of the Montaukes. They're offered land in Freetown and were told they could always return to their ancestral lands if they wished. The Montaukes were given money and the promise of money to pay for their children's education. The Montaukets could not read the documents, nor could they even sign their own names. Benson, of course, after they leave, tears down or burns the Montaukes' houses and papers. How about this one? He also tried to bar the residents of the town from hunting in Montauk. That's like telling the Bonicas they can't drive on the beach. Benson dies in 1890, and his widow Jane and children Frank and Mary then take over. Okay, I think we have another image coming up. Okay, Austin Corbin. Corbin began his financial career in the Midwest by buying up the lands of homesteaders who could not pay their mortgages. And he owned a plantation in Arkansas where he used convict labor. He founded a banking company and soon had enough money to invest in railroads. Railroads, in Corbin's view, were to bring wealthy people from their homes to luxurious resorts. He paid low wages and took great pride in crushing unions and replacing their members with imported immigrants. You can imagine what he thought of the Montaukets. In May of 1895, the railroad tracks under Corbin reach Amagansett. Now Corbin wants to extend the line to Montauk, and needs to purchase the land from the Bensons. Arthur Benson has died, so Corbin is now dealing with his widow and two children, one of them being Frank Benson. But Corbin is unsure of the Bensons' clear title to the land. To solve the problem, Corbin and Frank Benson work out a legal plan of action. Corbin would renege on his plan to buy to purchase the Benson land, and then Benson would bring a friendly lawsuit against Corbin to compel him to complete the purchase. So then it goes to court. The courts eventually sided with the Bensons and gave them clear title to the land Corbin wanted to purchase. Corbin and Pratt purchased 5,500 acres of land at Montauk from the Bensons. The price was $200,000. They purchased 4,000 acres from the center of Fort Pond Bay to the west border of Oyster Pond, and 1,500 acres bordering all sides of Fort Pond Bay. Corbin then secures the right-of-way through the Hither Hills from the Bensons. He then builds the line from Amagansett to Montauk. I think we have another image. All right, there's Fort Pond Bay, all right? Now, Corbin's plan was to build a deep water port at Fort Pond, where transatlantic passengers could debark and travel by train to New York City, saving a day of travel time. Corbin then begins to lobby Congress to establish a duty-free port at Fort Pond, despite the objections of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers were against the building of a deep water port because of the fog in the area and the sunken rocks. By 1896, the bill seems headed for passage. Then fate steps in. In a headline in the New York Times, June 5th, 1896, Austin Corbin dead, thrown out of his carriage at Newport, New Hampshire, lives about 7 hours, suffers severely a portion of the time from his injuries, leg broken, the head badly cut, his scalp laid bare with 2 great gashes, and his lips and chin frightfully lacerated. You didn't have to read the rest of the article. These were all the little mini headlines before you got to the article. What's left? And John Stokes, his coachman, also died, and then the bill dies in Congress. Okay? Now, we have an image, another image. All right, this is Wyandank Pharaoh. His correct title would be Sachem Wyandank, not king. They were calling the people kings and queens down there, flattering the Montaukes, but they would never, I don't think, consider that by their own people. He was the son of Queen Maria and King David. He was born in a wigwam in Indian Field on Montauk and was one of 5 children in his family. As a boy, he roamed the Montauk Peninsula hunting ducks and geese, which he sold white settlers on Montauk and in East Hampton, helping to bring in money which aided his family to survive. He was generally recognized as the legal and rightful sachem of the Montaukets. He was 57 years old at the time of his death. He was a skilled hunter and fisherman and was employed as a carpenter for Wilson's Bottling Works in Sag Harbor. Now, The coming of the railroad to Montauk did not please one local group, the Montaukett Indians. In 1897, the Indians, under the leadership of their chief and king, Wyandank Farrow, began a suit against the Long Island Railroad to recover possession of certain lands in the Hither Hills. The Indians lost the first skirmish. In April 1898, the appellate division sustained a judgment entered on the railroad's demurrer to the Indians' complaint. The court held that the Indians had no capacity to sue, but only a right to the beneficial use of the land. The court added that there was no provision in law by which they could bring an ejectment suit as a body or tribe, and that they had no corporate name on which to institute a suit. On June 19, 1898, the Indians brought a new action for ejectment, but this time in the name of Eugene A. Johnson, a clergyman, and one of the half-dozen or so full-blooded Montauk Indians. The argument came before the court in November. The railroad claimed that the Indians could not sue either as a tribe or as individuals. In fact, that the red man did not actually exist. The Indians, having intermarried with Negroes until the genuine red man was quite extinct and overwhelmed by the black, and that there was really no longer a tribe of Montauk Indians. The Indians' Council claimed that New York state and federal laws recognized the tribe and its rights. On February 28, 1899, the court handed down this decision against the Indians. The Montauks again appealed, won a favorable ruling. However, in April 1900, the railroad secured a verdict once again, a final one this time, no it wasn't, in the Court of Appeals. The court held that the Montauks could get legal redress only through a special act of the legislature, which would specifically confer power on them to bring an action, since neither as a tribe or as individuals did they possess legal status in the courts. Well, it goes on. It finally reached the court of Judge Abel Blackmore in 1909. Reading the local papers, the whites in East Hampton ridiculed the Montaukets, the Montaukets' attempt to sue the LIRR, referring to the Montauks as darkies who were claiming to be Indians to get money from the Bensons. People were convinced the Montaukets were lazy, shiftless, and generally were useless. Blackmore's decision in 1909 stated that the Montaukets had lost their Native American traits. There was no longer a tribe of Montauk Indians, and they lost their right to sue. The final appeal was lost in 1918. And I think we have one more image. This is a group of Montaukets who went to Washington in 1921 to try to further their cause. There's Marguerite Fowler. Down on the left, that's the wife of Joseph Laporte. We don't know. John Strong said he could not find out much about what happened when they went there. They were probably given a short audience and then, kind of dismissed. And on that happy note, we're going to end the first part of our program. You can applaud. Okay, while we're going to have a very, very short intermission, our technical advisor, Richard Barons, is going to have to come in and fix one of the lights in here. But we have time for a couple of comments or corrections. Yes, go ahead, Mrs. Somebody.
Okay. When you first started with the pictures up there, you said it was Joseph Delapola. My mother and father are locked away.
I'm sorry?
When you first,
It wasn't Joseph Delapola. It was her mother and father, Amato Delapola.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So we don't have a picture of Joseph Delapola?
No.
Oh, all right. Just seeing if you were paying attention, Mrs. Curls. Thank you. I knew there'd be a correct. Any others? Do we have our group? You see anybody, Mike? You do. Okay. Let's put the screen up. Can we go shut that off? All right. Okay, now, wait a minute. Richard, you fixed the light?
yes.
And thank you, Richard, for doing the pictures. Thank you very much. Is this enough, Mike? Okay, are you ready? Okay. You've heard of Take Two. You've heard of Take Five. You've heard of Take It Easy. You've heard Take My Word For It. You've heard Take a Bite Out Of. You've heard Take a Crack At. And you've heard Take a Chance On. Well, now appearing recently from appearances at the Crystal Room, Cabanero's Bar and Grill, and Merrill's Irish Mist, let's welcome Take Two.
Choo 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 choo, choo 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 choo. Pardon me, boys, at the Chattanooga choo 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 choo. Track 29, track 29, or you can give me a shine, 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 shine 'em up fine. I can afford to board the Chattanooga choo 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 choo. I got my fare, and just a trifle to spare. A trifle to spare. You leave the Pennsylvania station about 3:45. You read a magazine and then you're in Baltimore. Dinner in the diner, nothing could be finer than to have your ham and eggs in Carolina. When you hear the whistle blowing 8 to the bar, that's when you know that Tennessee is not very far. Shamalala golden, gotta keep 'em rolling. Woo woo Chattanooga, there you are. Oh, there's gonna be a certain party at the station, dressed in satin and lace, satin and lace. I used to call funny face, I used to call funny face. She's gonna cry until I tell her that I'll never roam. Oh, Chattanooga choo-choo, won't you choo-choo me home? Oh, Chattanooga choo-choo, won't you choo-choo me home? Choo-choo me home.
The next song is a song actually called Alabama Bound and Midnight Choo Choo. We've taken a little liberty with the words, so bear with us.
Alabama gets it bound. There'll be some bonnet puppies hanging round. Just be the meanest ticket man on earth. All I'm worth to put my tootsies in an upper berth. Just hear that lonely whistle sound. I'm gonna cover the ground, and then I'll holler so the world will know. Here I go, I'm Amagansett bound. Oh, when that midnight choo-choo leaves for Bonnet Glen, I'll be right there. Yes, Bob. I got my fare. When I see that rusty-haired conductor man, what a man, I'll grab him by the collar and I'll holler, where's the clan? That's where you stop your train that brings me back again, down home where I remain, where my bonnet clan. I will be right there with bells when that old conductor yells, all aboard, woo, all aboard for Bonnet Glen. This train is choo-choo leaving, trains are leaving, Amagansett midnight choo-choo. I'm Amagansett bound.
Carol Bill, Karen Mullen, Bethany Trowbridge, Linda Byer. Take two. Now you can go. And now you can take a hike. All right. That's it, right, Richard? We're done? That's it. Richard's not saying anything. Good night.